Thanks to the CBA and its staff, Hillary, and our technical assistant today. I want to give you just a little bit of background on this course. I started a version of this course about 9 years ago at the John Glenn School of Public Policy at Ohio State University. Some of you know Doug Jones, who ran an organization called the National Regulatory Research Institute that was based at Ohio State for many years. Doug also taught in the Glenn School Public Policy to grad students primarily. And in a graduate level seminar, he taught public utility regulation for many years. Now, it was a great shtick. You think about being a college professor. He sat in the front of the room and basically invited a guest speaker to come every week for 13 weeks to teach kind of their segment or the area of their expertise in the industry. And I always thought, Doug, how do you get this job? But he had to line up the speakers, obviously, organize the program, give the exams, and probably grade the exams too. So there was more to it than that. But he obviously would invite folks from all the utility segments, electric, natural gas. I think he did transportation even, and telecom. And one day he said, hey, would you do an hour on sort of the history of the telecom industry with an emphasis on public policy? And I thought, well, that's a pretty steep climb to try to stuff that into 1 hour, but we managed to do it. And over the years, the course has expanded. The PowerPoint has certainly expanded for those of you who downloaded it. And I've also done this, a more legal version of it at the Moritz Law School at Ohio State in recent years. Sam Porter, one of the partners now deceased at Porter Wright, taught a similar class, third-year law students, on public utility regulation. And I got invited 1 year while Sam was there, and then Dan Conway, who's now a commissioner at the PUCO, took that course over, and Dan's had me up several times to teach a version of this. Law students all want citations for some reason. I don't remember really wanting a lot of citations, but we loaded it up with some citations for those of you who are interested in that aspect. And it is, by the way, a CLE class, so it's the first time anybody's paid to hear this, and I've never been paid to put it on, but maybe some point in the future that will happen. We call it Telecom 101 just almost jokingly, but it is supposed to be an introduction to the telecom industry. I'm going to discuss the intersection of technology, law, and public policy in the context of the telecom industry. My two main premises are these. Technology has had a profound impact on public policy and the law, and conversely, public policy and the law have had a profound impact on technology. I've got to give you a good dose of history to put some meat on these bones, and I apologize for that, for the premises to be fully understood. This history will show you that the telecom industry has really come full circle from complete competition to essentially complete regulation, and back another 350 degrees maybe to relatively open competition throughout the industry. Once again, given all this history, it is legitimate to ask what level of regulation is appropriate or necessary given all these changes and today's environment. And with the convergence, I've got a slide on that, of so many technologies, what regulatory and legal models, if any, are appropriate to be applied to those technologies. You'll see that the telecom industry represents a good example of the interaction between government and business, and I'll say the occasional conflicts between the free enterprise system and the public interest. We'll see how the telecom industry has progressed, sometimes because of public policy, both legal and regulatory, and sometimes despite it or in its absence. I'd like to introduce the inventors and their inventions. I used to kind of sprinkle these throughout the presentation. as I said, and other protagonists. But I decided the last few times I've done this, I like the Brady Bunch approach. We're just going to introduce all these characters and then talk about them as the presentation progresses. Here's a name you probably don't recognize, and you'll wonder, why is he talking about this? Well, it's George Stephenson, English inventor and father, really, of the modern railroad. George Stephenson is one of those guys that looked at a bunch of technologies that were out there and thought, gee, these could be converged. And the technologies he looked at primarily were the wheel. Thank you, ancient Greeks or whoever came up with the wheel. The steam engine, which had actually been fairly successful for about 20 years already in England, and iron rail. And he thought, hey, I could combine a steam engine with wheels and an iron rail and have a vehicle that propels itself. Thus, the beginning of the modern railroad. We'll find out later why the railroad really is so important to the development of this later technology, telecommunications. Second in the Brady Bunch, one of my favorite lawyers, one of my favorite presidents, Abraham Lincoln. People forget, and you don't get taught this in elementary school. Abraham Lincoln was one of the preeminent railroad lawyers in the country. He represented the Illinois Central Railroad as their main outside counsel and is one of the people really responsible for the westward expansion of the railroad in the United States, and a number of legal precedents you can assign to Abraham Lincoln and his litigation and appellate skills, primarily in Illinois. This is for those of you who enjoy this stuff, I love this portrait of him. It's an amateur portrait done for the Lincoln Library's annual report a couple of years ago. Samuel F.B. Morse by Matthew Brady. It's interesting, Matthew Brady is the famous Civil War photographer, and I think this is from about 1840. It's certainly before the Civil War. He's credited with inventing the first practical telegraph in 1838. He also brought photography to the United States from France in the form of the daguerreotype, which he had seen demonstrated in France and thought, hey, I'm taking that technology home with me to the US. FB does not, though, stand for Facebook. Here's our own Thomas Alva Edison, Milan, not Milan, Ohio. Anybody from Milan? That's a funny place to visit, his little birthplace and the town. I think it's the town with the first paved street in the United States. It had nothing to do with Edison, but it's just an interesting thing to see. Probably the most prolific inventor in US history. He had 3 months of formal school education. Otherwise, he was home-taught and self-taught, primarily self-taught, homeschooled by his mother. There are almost 1,100 patents in Edison's name, and his name appears on a whole slew of others. Primarily responsible, although we'll see a big exception here in a few moments, for the design, if you will, of the electric distribution system in the United States and how to generate power, how to get it to homes and businesses. We have another interesting individual, Granville Woods, from both Columbus and Cincinnati. He later moved to Cincinnati, an inventor with over 60 inventions. Mr. Woods perfected what was called the multiplex telegraph. And if you picture a train going down the tracks, he figured out the way to send a telegraph signal back and forth to a moving train. Now, it's one thing to have telegraph sets at the end of a wire, stationary and fixed. He figured out the methodology to have a moving train pick up those signals and be able to transmit where it was kind of today we'd call it logistics. How fast are you going? When will you be at the next station? That sort of thing. He's best known for his work on electric subways and the proverbial third rail. The third rail, of course, isn't just a proverb. There is a third rail in places like New York City and Boston that you'll get electrocuted on if you step on it or fall on it. But he came up with this idea of this powered third rail to drive electric subways. Prior to that, they were internal combustion engines, and you can imagine the fumes and the smoke in both Boston and New York when they were operating those subways with engines rather than motors. Woods had patent disputes with both Bell and Edison and won a few of them. This is an era where these inventors are all competing with one another. Who can come up with the next greatest thing? And it led to a lot of patent litigation over the years. Have you heard the term patent trolls? Patent troll, there's a negative aspect to it and a positive. The negative aspect is a patent troll is somebody invents a new device. The patent troll raises their hand and say, hey, I patented that, or I patented a piece of that, an important piece of that you're using without paying me royalties. There's a lot of litigation in this field these days, especially in the technology arena, where somebody says, well, the chip that I invented is what makes that happen, and you haven't recognized that yet. Granville Woods was involved in many of those disputes. The positive part of patent trolling I wanted to mention is people are entitled to royalties, if they have a legitimate claim to some aspect of a new technology. So it's not all bad. Probably the star here, Alexander Graham Bell. He was a Scottish-born scientist and teacher of the deaf. Both his mother and wife were deaf, and one of his inspirations was developing devices that could help the deaf hear. So his intentions were, for a large part, altruistic. Fast forward 100 years to the cochlear implants and the industry his invention created. It would be a world that Bell would not recognize. This photo reminds me of Kris Kringle in my favorite movie, Miracle on 34th Street. Elisha Gray from Barnesville, Ohio. We have a guest here from Barnesville, Ohio, Jeff Jones, another hometown boy. Elisha Gray, another prolific inventor in this space. He actually co-founder of Western Electric, which was the manufacturer in the good old days of most of the equipment that you'll see when we get to the props, much of the early equipment, I should say. And later he formed a company with a partner named Barton, and interestingly, they called that Gray Bar. They have a facility on Kinnear Road. It's one of these things when I see that, I think, oh, that's Elisha Gray from 120 years ago. That's the business he created. They're basically in the business of supplying electrical equipment to the electric distribution industry. He was a professor at Oberlin College. Here's one of my other favorites. I got a lot of favorites, but I love the robber barons. I don't know how many of you have read about the robber barons or seen some of these American Experience videos and PBS shows on this era, but these guys were unbelievable. And Jay Gould is one of the premier railroad robber barons. He was from Roxbury, New York, leading American railroad developer and speculator. He's been portrayed as one of the ruthless robber barons of the Gilded Age, whose success at business made him one of the richest men of his era. According to Wikipedia, he was hated and reviled with few defenders then or now. Jay Gould, we'll find out later, ended up acquiring all of the telegraph systems in the United States that were not owned by Western Union. And somehow the telegraph industry had as its largest customer the railroads. So, there were all these interlocking directorates, all sorts of shenanigans going on, I'm sure, in the corporate world back then. And Jay Gould managed to turn his investment in the telegraph industry into majority ownership of all the railroads owned by the Vanderbilt family, which was about 2/3 of the railroads in the United States. So one of the true robber barons. The radio, Guglielmo Marconi. I love these outfits too. Look at that collar. I call him the father, maybe the godfather of everything wireless. And we'll talk about wireless props later on. I wish he'd been here to see how some of his inventions have transpired in real life. He shared the 1909 Nobel Prize in Physics. He had dozens of patents. The 1912 sinking of the Titanic showed that his invention could save lives. It didn't happen to save a whole lot. In fact, they lost many lives in the sinking of the Titanic. Interesting fact, in the radio room on the Titanic, the people operating the radios were actually Marconi employees. So they were hired by the steamship line, White Star, I think was its name, to run all of the Marconi radios that were supposed to, keep in touch with other ships, ship to shore, that sort of thing, to prevent disasters like the sinking of the Titanic. Now, I have a recent experience to relate here. I call it related inventions because we'll talk about several of his. Nikola Tesla. I had never heard that name until they named a car after him. Did anybody else know about him, more than 5 years ago? Nikola Tesla has an amazing role in this industry and in technology generally. He was a Serbian-American mechanical and electrical engineer, almost forgotten. The Tesla car, of course, has revived interest in him. We were just at Niagara Falls last week, and there's this huge, larger-than-life statue of Tesla. There are two of them, one on the American side of the falls and one on the Canadian, because he really is credited with not inventing, but perfecting the technology of hydroelectric power. Just like George Stephenson and the railroad, Tesla kind of put together these ideas of spinning a turbine with water. Nobody had really done that. People had spun, in a flour mill, grist mill. You could spin a mill with water, but nobody had thought of spinning a turbine with water connected to a generator to generate electric power. And so he had one of these aha moments and developed this technology. First launched, interestingly, in Serbia. And some Westinghouse engineers were over there examining what they were doing, and they hired Tesla. They said, you should come back to America with us. I don't think he went with them right away, but he packed his bags essentially and decided, okay, I'll go to America and work on this technology. Westinghouse, and this is in about 1905, so think of this number. Westinghouse gave him a contract paying $10,000 a month. He lived in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York in a penthouse. He happened to love pigeons, and he opened all the windows in his suite in the Waldorf Astoria so the pigeons could fly in. And there's another photograph of him, I should put that in, with 100 pigeons sitting in that room, and he's sitting in the middle, like feeding them corn. And it's an unbelievable story. He ran up bills, though, at the Waldorf, $20,000, and didn't pay. Moved to another hotel. Left all the pigeon droppings behind. Tesla is critically important because, as I said, Edison came up with this idea for distributing electricity from generation to consumer. Tesla was an advocate, though, of alternating current. Now, I know enough about this part of the technology to be dangerous, but I'll tell you the way I understand it. Edison believed in DC, direct current. You have like a 12-volt DC flashlight or whatever you might have. Edison thought that was going to be the way to distribute electricity in the country, and all the stuff that he had built was with that in mind. We're going to have a direct current, low voltage system. Tesla, on the other hand, and Westinghouse, his employer, which, they're interested in building all this equipment, focused on alternating current at 120 volts, 10 times the voltage of the Edison idea. Edison really railed against this. Tesla actually worked for Edison for a very short time, but like, two geniuses, you can just imagine the collisions of the brain power. Tesla's view was that this 120 volt system was going to, and this is the one that was already employed in Serbia, this was going to be the one that would win the day, and it would be cheaper to operate, all kinds of positives in favor of it. But Edison was dead set against it. And to demonstrate his displeasure with the idea, Edison publicly executed 11 elephants around the country with the Tesla electricity to show this is how dangerous this would be if the United States adopts this crazy man's ideas. Everybody will get electrocuted like these elephants. So a really interesting chapter in technology history. I try to pick the most representative photos of these people. Ted Turner, basically the father of cable TV. There are a lot of other people involved in that industry, investors, inventors, everybody, but Ted Turner really, among all of them, is the American media mogul. And again, flattering portrait. Ted was born in Cincinnati, 1938. He inherited his father's outdoor advertising business. The old days of billboards, which you still see, but not like you used to. At the age of 24, and bought a UHF television station on Channel 17 in Atlanta for, pennies on the dollar. He bought UHF. Nobody watched UHF back in the day. Here in Columbus, you watched maybe Channel 34, WOSU, but nothing else. Nothing else was on UHF. But he bought Channel 17 and then figured out how to link it with cable TV systems to become WTBS, Turner Broadcasting System. And the national scope of cable TV, which had been a very geographic specific industry, the national scope then of the cable TV industry was born with Ted Turner's investments. They showed reruns of old movies, old TV series, and current Atlanta sports programs. Nothing has really changed. He's the second largest private landowner in the United States, which is an amazing statistic. The largest private landowner is a guy named John Malone. Guess what he is? Another cable TV magnate. Turner has donated $1 billion to the United Nations Foundation. Martin Cooper was an engineer with Motorola and is the person really most responsible for the invention of the portable cellular telephone when we get to the props. But he's holding one of the Dynatec phones there. This is not an era-specific photo. This is a much later trade show where he was a speaker. He held 11 patents, all in the name of course, Motorola. Steve Jobs is one of the key players here in the wireless arena. This is the cover of the Walter Isaacson biography of Steve Jobs, which is a fascinating book just about the personality and the development of the wireless technology. I'd say the latter half of it is where you get into the iPhone. The first half is all the other stuff that Apple was doing, the PC, uh, you know, uh, all the early technology items that they developed and marketed. It's a great book. There's a story in there I'll just mention briefly. Steve Jobs was thinking about the iPod, and they had come up with this concept of let's have a small device on which you can record music and play it back. We had we had a Walkman. It had to have a cassette in it. Later, I think maybe even a mini CD, whatever. Larger device. Steve Jobs had this idea, here's the mouse, something about as big as a mouse, that you could put in your pocket and listen to. I think his original thing was, I want 1,000 songs. And the engineers just shook their heads and said, there's no way you put 1,000 songs on anything that size or anything you're going to put in your pocket. It'll take a box like a PC. But Jobs was convinced, and they went to Japan, shopped all the electronic firms in Japan, and he took with him a 50-cent piece. I didn't bring one today. But think of a 50-cent piece, and he'd lay that down in the meeting, and he said, I want a hard drive that size. What can you do for me? And most of them just shook their heads and said, there's no way. We'd build one 4 times that size with half the memory, but there's no way we can build a hard drive to your specs on your timeline to fulfill this need. The only one that said yes was Samsung. And the Samsung people said, we can do that. And they did. The hard drive in the original iPod looks like a 50-cent piece. And I'd forgotten even that it was a hard drive. I thought it was all in a chip. But there actually is a hard drive that spins and holds 1,000 songs. Ted Stevens is a famous character on the government side of this story. He was now deceased, but he was the U.S. Senator from Alaska, of all places, not a technology or telecom hotbed necessarily, but he was the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee for many years just because of seniority and his pick of committees. He oversaw a lot of the stuff we'll be talking about, passage of Telecom Act of 1996 and others. As you may know, the president's appointments to the FCC go through the Senate Commerce Committee for confirmation. So the chairman of that committee has a lot of sway in Washington about what's happening in this space. In fact, I practiced there for about 7 years and came to know that if you look at the makeup of the FCC at any given time, and I'm talking from its inception in 1934, one member of that commission will be actually the appointee of the Senate Commerce Committee chairman, because the president gives that chairman so much deference in exchange for essentially approval and acceptance of the president's 4 appointees. So at any given time, one of the members of the FCC is somebody off the staff or the hand-picked nominee of the Senate Commerce Committee chairman. Ted Stevens, though, is famous for saying in a committee hearing, the internet is a system of tubes. Dave remembers that phrase. After being lobbied heavily by the industry that was talking to him about the size of the pipes that needed to be built to handle all the traffic on the internet and all the emerging wireless traffic, he just happened to get the word pipes mixed up with tubes. It doesn't really matter. Al Gore is my last protagonist, former vice president and former senator from Tennessee, not, though, the father of global warming, as the picture might depict, but he was a positive influence on the development of the internet. Nothing like a technical hiccup in a semi-technical presentation. Al Gore, though, was very helpful in many of these venues. Let's talk finally about the public policy landscape. I describe some events, statutes and regulations, and case law for those of you who want to write down citations. So get your pencils ready. One of the events was the invention of the railroad. George Stephenson, as you saw, the British inventor, came up with the idea. It didn't really achieve any commercial acceptance until about 1830. Baltimore, Maryland, while it's on the East Coast and on the Chesapeake Bay, was basically landlocked. New York had developed a canal system which propelled New York into the forefront of commerce in the United States, and the city fathers in Baltimore thought, what are we going to do? And somebody came up with the idea, let's build a railroad. So the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad came out of that desire on the part of the city of Baltimore to be involved in modern commerce in the 1830s. It was the third largest city in the United States at that time, but had no access to canals, even though it was close to the frontier. In the 1830s and 1840s, all around the country, eminent domain laws were not established. They were already in place for the government to take private property for a public use. It's the first time the eminent domain laws, though, were amended to allow private parties to take private land for so-called public purposes. And it allowed the railroads to expand. The railroads would go to a certain area, decide where the track should be laid, and if they couldn't get right away through municipal areas, they'd start through private land. And they had their little easement agreements to get all the farmers and the landowners to give them a swath of land so that they could build the railroad. It's a lot of what Abraham Lincoln litigated in Illinois in that era. Is there a question back there? Okay, I'm sorry. If you have a question or anything, raise your hand, make noise, whatever. In 1862, Congress passed what was called the Pacific Railroad Act. Think about that year. Lincoln has been president for 2 years, and all of a sudden Congress is enacting federal law for the first time to encourage the expansion of the railroad westward. Well, the westernmost railroad at that time was not the Union Pacific. It hadn't been formed yet. Guess which one it was? The Illinois Central Railroad. So the idea was the Illinois Central Railroad is already out there, and man, they'll be able to expand westward across the Mississippi River, across the plains, California, whatever. Well, they ran into a problem, and that was the formation in San Francisco by the bankers of the Union Pacific Railroad. From 1830 till the 1880s, really, there was no federal regulation of the railroads. It was a wide open marketplace. You could get into the railroad business if you could go acquire the land, buy the assets, and get into the business. There was no federal regulation. Some states, though, did attempt to regulate railroads, and not just on the intra-state, within a state component. They attempted to regulate the entry of an operation in their states of what were typically interstate railroads at that time. This led to a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision. I'll give you the citation. 118 U.S. 557. It's Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railway Company versus Illinois, of all states. But Illinois had tried to regulate some aspects of the interstate railroads coming through that state. And this is at a time when this Pacific Railroad Act had really lit the fire under the westward expansion of the railroad. It's the case in which the Supreme Court said, citing the Commerce Clause, which gives the Congress exclusive power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. It was a 6-3 decision in the U.S. Supreme Court, so there were fair contingent there of kind of states' rights advocates, but the majority of 6 justices won out with the view that no, the railroad business is really interstate in nature, and we can't have the states interfering with it. 1 year later, Congress enacted the Interstate Commerce Act, based entirely on the holding of that 6-3 Supreme Court decision. The federal government decided, well, then we're going to regulate a lot of other aspects of commerce, the first being the railroads, which were the main focus of early regulation by the Interstate Commerce Commission. It was the first federal law. Think about this. This is 100 years after the country was founded. If you count, don't count 1789. I'm counting 1787 or so. It was the first federal law to regulate private industry of any kind in the country. Every federal law prior to that was all about governing and the monetary system and that sort of thing. There was no regulation of private industry in the United States until 1887. The act required that railroad rates be reasonable and just, but it did not empower the commission to fix specific rates. They could just review them and determine if they were reasonable or just, or in response to a complaint, perhaps, make that determination. But they did not set the rates charged by the railroads. It also required that the railroads publicize shipping rates in tariffs. So tariffs became the mode through which regulation was enforced, and prohibited discrimination of many kinds. Price discrimination in smaller markets. The ICC had a provision that protected farmers who all they were trying to do, ship their grain, to the local grain elevator, protect them from price discrimination to any great extent. The Commerce Commission began this extensive regulation of the railroads. It was later authorized through amendments to the Interstate Commerce Act to regulate other modes of transportation and commerce. This slide shows a little bit of the expansion that we're talking about. Let me see if I can do this without turning it off. If you look at this, it looks like a pretty competitive market, but and it is, at a certain level, but on a point-to-point basis, there are a lot of monopolies here. If you want, the one I looked at, if you want to go from Pittsburgh to Cincinnati, I thought that was the one I looked at. Well, let's say Pittsburgh to Columbus. Obviously, the Pennsylvania Railroad is the one to take. You can get to Columbus by taking the others. It's like flying across the country on about 4 different airlines. You could stitch together a route to get you where you wanted to go. It'd probably be prohibitively expensive, take a long time. But if you wanted to ship anything from Mackinac City down to, maybe Union City in Indiana, that's going to be on the Pennsylvania Railroad, of course. Does anybody recognize the 4 names of those railroads? They're from the Monopoly board game. I love the fact that they borrowed the early names of these railroads to create the board game. And when I was a kid, getting a railroad in Monopoly, that was a big deal. And the older I've gotten, I realize that was a big deal to get a railroad. Events, the telegraph. Well, we talked about Samuel F.B. Morse patented the first telegraph in 1838. He split up his patent rights with a group of investors and also to gain the support of what are referred to as influential partners. Doesn't describe who they were. 62 people claimed to have also invented the telegraph. So they were all part of the massive litigation that I explained, talking about Samuel F.B. Morse of the early days of the telegraph. Morse really beat everybody to it by figuring out not just the technology, but kind of the business model of how to put a company together to make this work, to make this profitable. He obtained a $30,000 grant from Congress, of all places, to run an experimental line between Baltimore and Washington. Remember, I mentioned that the railroads were the telegraph's #1 customer. So to run a line from Baltimore to Washington primarily helped the B&O Railroad. And it came to pass that the B&O Railroad was one of the largest customers of the telegraph business. Morse and his partners voluntarily licensed their technology to a number of other people so that the technology could expand. They didn't have the wherewithal to build these systems everywhere. So there were dozens, maybe a couple of hundred telegraph companies in the United States at one time. Incidentally, the congressman from Maine who pushed for that $30,000 grant in 1843 became a partner of Morse's in the telegraph business. The railroads soon discovered the importance of the telegraph for logistics and safety and became, as I've said, the telegraph's largest customers. There were 10 telegraph companies serving just New York City in 1851. Western Union was one of the largest, and it began acquiring a bunch of the other ones, consolidating on the map, buying the companies in Ohio, buying companies in Western Pennsylvania, wherever they might be. So Western Electric went through this long period of industry consolidation. As I mentioned, the small competitors, the ones left behind, caught the attention of our robber baron friend, Jay Gould. He acquired them, consolidated them, and ended up buying out the Vanderbilt family. If you've ever been to the Biltmore estate in North Carolina, it's like the idea of buying out that family is almost unheard of, but he succeeded in doing so. The Union used the telegraph to its great advantage in the Civil War. There's a fairly recent book by Tom Wheeler, who was the chairman of the FCC in the Obama administration. He's an Ohio State graduate. He was the industry lobbyist for first the cable TV industry and later the cellular telephone industry. And much to the chagrin of some of the consumer advocates, I think they were shocked when President Obama appointed this industry lobbyist, of all people, to be chairman of the FCC. But my view is I think he did an outstanding job. He was a great public face for the FCC. They made a lot of progress on a lot of fronts in the wireless arena. From 1866 to 1900, so a course of about 40 years, Western Union was the dominant telegraph provider. They were earning annual profits of 30 to 40% in that era. And you look at your statements today, and man, if you're making 3 or 4%, sometimes you're happy. But to do annually in that era, 30 to 40% was unbelievable. Their president was a fellow named William Orton, and he described the telegraph as the nervous system of commerce. Efforts to regulate that company in particular, but the industry in general in Congress simply failed. There was no appetite for regulating this, what was viewed as a startup, very successful industry, this engine of commerce. Why would we clamp down on that if there's no evidence of abuses or otherwise? In 1909, AT&T, which we'll get into in a few minutes, acquired Western Union. Well, that was probably the straw that broke the camel's back, because Congress and the federal government thought, well, now we got this company in the newfangled telephone business acquiring our old friend Western Union. That's almost too much to take. Action at the federal government during that time included the action against Standard Oil, the Rockefeller enterprise. Succeeded in breaking up Standard Oil, and just 4 years later, 1913, the government kind of imposed its will, not through litigation, but called the AT&T folks into a room and said, this is unacceptable, and AT&T divested Western Union at that time. In 1910, Congress also enacted the Mann-Elkins Act, which is the first time that the federal government was given the power to regulate actually regulate telegraph rates. They had followed the model of the railroad industry, and you'll see along in this presentation, there are a lot of regulatory models that were created, and rather than ignore those old models and start over and reinvent the wheel, a lot of this is just the adaptation of old regulatory models to new technologies, and that's really been the pattern of our public policy history in the country. The rates for telegraphs, again, were not set by the government, but the telegraph companies had to file tariffs and have non-discrimination provisions, that sort of thing. Public utility commissions at the state level were really an outgrowth of the Mann-Elkins Act, because Congress declared that, we're regulating the interstate aspects of this business. So they kind of chopped back a little bit on the Wabash precedent and said, we'll leave to the states regulation of the intra-state aspects of the telegraph business. So state public utility commissions sprang up in that era, but they also sprang up because of the advent of the electric distribution, natural gas distribution, and transportation industries. So most commissions in that era had 4 or 5 industries that they were regulating. Fast forward a little bit to 1934, and Congress really for the first time decided, well, we're going to now regulate the telephone industry, which had been around for almost 50 years. In 34, Congress, of course, was dealing with, no pun intended, the New Deal proposals of President Franklin Roosevelt. And the FCC, Federal Communications Act, is actually a small part of one of those big New Deal legislative packages, almost like a footnote in a much longer act that had to do with social welfare, various programs. By this time, radio and telephone had diminished the impact of the telegraph, even though the telegraph business was still fairly active, even into the early, mid-1980s. For the most part, nobody was sending telegraphs after about 1950. The telephone. Let's finally talk about the telephone. Oh, I didn't show the telegraph map. This is another great map, not from the Monopoly board game. But 1853, you can hardly see the little lines, but the telegraph was very extensive across the country. And guess what it followed? The railroad business. The telegraph lines basically paralleled every railroad track in the country because the railroads were their largest users. Private people and businesses, of course, and the government sent telegraphs, but the railroads were the overwhelming customers of this invention of Samuel F.B. Morse. You can see in Ohio there, you could send a telegraph about anywhere, maybe even Barnesville, Joe. Okay, the telephone. William Orton, I mentioned him before, the president of Western Union, the largest telegraph company, contracted with Thomas Edison and Elisha Gray, who we've met, to find a way to send multiple telegraph messages over a single wire. At that time, a telegraph operator sat there with a device like this, tapping out, the X's and O's, or the shorts and the longs, whatever you want to call them, Morse code, on a single wire to a certain specified destination. There was really no switching involved. It was a very primitive system. Orton, though, had invested all this money in building this system, and it was nearing capacity. So he wanted to figure out a way, is there a way to send multiple messages over one wire? Well, guess what? These technology freaks figured it out. They figured out what's called multiplexing, that you could send one signal at a certain frequency over that wire, and you'd turn the amplifier up or down, get to another frequency, and send another message right over top of it without interference, without static. So they came up with this multiplex telegraph. which saved Orton and Western Union billions of dollars. They would have had to add on to all the wires, all the system that they had in place. But over just a matter of a few years, they saved a fortune in construction expenses with this fairly simple concept of sending more than one message over the wire. Other inventors were looking at this and trying to figure out, they would have liked to have sold an idea or two to Western Union also. And Alexander Graham Bell, one of our stars, thought, well, I'm going to go one step further. How about sending voice over a telegraph wire? Well, that didn't interest a lot of people because the system was designed to send Morse code, X's and O's. It was very efficient. Everybody knew how it worked. The railroads loved it. But Bell had this idea, again, back to his altruistic background. He wanted to help the deaf. So he came up with this instrument. I wish I knew the size of that. I think it's about 12 inches wide. It looks like a box. It's like 12 inches wide and 12 inches high. But he believed in this theory that voice could be sent over a wire and not just multiple telegraph messages. He went to work in Boston in his laboratory. He found some investor friends to bankroll this, and he hired a guy, Thomas Watson, who was an experienced electrical designer, to help him. One of the props, you'll see the VHS tape there. If you're at your library, I'm sure they don't have that anymore, except maybe on the table where they're selling stuff that hasn't been checked out for 25 years. It's the Alexander Graham Bell story, and it has the great scene in it when Bell is in one room of the laboratory. He's actually a floor away, and he's talking into this device, and he spills hydrochloric acid on his pants, and he starts burning through. It's a great scene in the movie. And he yells, "Mr. Watson, come here, I need you." And Watson hears the message on the other instrument in the other room and comes running. So again, a great scene in sports. It demonstrated not only transmitting voice over the telegraph, but it gave rise to the expression pants on fire. Bell and Watson applied for a patent. It was granted. It's in 1876. If you've been to the original Smithsonian Castle in Washington, D.C., you may recall that was the Centennial Exposition of the United States, 100 years after 1776. It just happens to be the year that Bell invented this thing, and they had it on display and available for people to talk into a telephone and go to another room, and hear somebody else's voice. So it was demonstrated in that Smithsonian Castle in 1876. First time, I believe, publicly demonstrated. Western Union offered Bell, other way around. Bell, having patented this device, there was a lot of patent litigation here too, just like with the telegraph. One of Bell's investors went to Western Union and said, "Hey, why don't you buy this? This would be an important technology for you to own." And the offering price was $100,000, which is roughly $2.5 million today. And William Orton had heard about the technology, hadn't seen it, but just kind of scoffed at the idea. And he said, "Oh, I've heard about this telephone. Who would want to use that?" So Western Union succeeded in, killing their industrial future in the telephone industry by turning down that offer. Patent disputes ensued and lasted about 12 years. There's a great set of cases, and one of them in particular, they're called the telephone cases, believe it or not. It's a series of U.S. Supreme Court decisions, late 1870s and 1880s, culminating in an 1888 decision by the Supreme Court. The name on that case is Dolbear, Dolbear versus American Bell Telephone Company. It's interesting. It's 126 U.S. 1. It's the whole volume of 126. I've seen that in a few law libraries. It's not just the decision of the court, but it's the whole case record in one volume of U.S. reports. It was decided on a 4-3 4-3 vote with 2 justices abstaining. And one biographer, they didn't have to disclose this at the time, one biographer thinks the 2 justices were stockholders in the American Bell Telephone Company. So they abstained, and the case was decided on a 4-3 vote. It did not unfold, though, without intrigue. There was a patent examiner, Zenas Fisk Wilbur, who stated in an affidavit that he was an alcoholic who was much in debt to Bell's lawyer, who had been a fellow soldier with him in the Civil War. The patent disputes, though, were eventually settled, primarily with that big Supreme Court decision. Again, 1 vote shy of a bad decision. And the Bell system started expanding just as the telegraph system had all around the country. Extensive distribution network being built, equipment put into place, and they were also licensing this technology to others. So this gave rise to what used to be called, although it's still sometimes referred to this, as the independent telephone companies. They were independent of the Bell system, but they were very much dependent on the Bell system for the licensing of the technology that they were using. But Bell saw that as a kind of a sideline. Oh, we'll license our stuff. People can go build, in the desert in Arizona, that sort of places we don't want to go. If somebody else wants to buy our stuff and build a system out there, kind of like a franchise. The big franchising companies, at least in my view, tend to own the really valuable properties, and they'll franchise you or somebody else to go build where they don't want to build. They know they've got a revenue stream coming out of that. One of the ironic stories, Jeff Jones, I know, knows this. There was a little independent company that started literally in the desert in Nevada. Well, that desert became Las Vegas, and that independent company still has that local telephone territory. For what that's worth, we'll get into that. But for many years, they were the monopoly telephone provider in Las Vegas, formerly Desert. Cleveland, Ohio, it's interesting because these independent companies sometimes competed with the Bell Company or right up against the boundaries of the Bell system. Cleveland had 3 telephone companies at that time. There was one do we have Clevelanders here? One on the east side of Cleveland, just like everybody thinks about it. There was a company on the east side of Cleveland, one on the west side, and one right in the middle, downtown Cleveland. But a downtown Cleveland business had to have all 3 telephones, had to subscribe to all 3 companies in order to serve that entire geographic area. At that time, there was no interconnection among the companies. So if you wanted to call outside your local calling area, long distance had been introduced, and you might be able to call one of those neighboring companies via long distance, but in the early years, not even that was possible. You had to have a phone actually installed in downtown Cleveland from, say, Euclid in order to call Euclid. There was no government regulation of the telephone industry at this time at all. So again, modeling the early years of the railroad, early years of the telegraph, nobody saw fit to regulate the startup business, new technology. Let's just see how it rolls out. And it rolled out very successfully. The companies were very successful. Telephones became a household appliance, really, in most American homes. Dave Bergman's favorite slide, the competing providers lines in New York City. That shows you how many telephone companies. I'm sure not every one of those wires is a separate company, but it was a crazy, map where a lot of companies could compete in the same space for the same business, and yet other areas went unserved or underserved. And that caught the attention finally of, guess who? The government. In 1903, 57% of the cities had telephone service, or that had telephone service, had 2 or more providers. And by 1907, the independent companies had almost as many customers as the Bell Company. A period of industry consolidation began, and that picture kind of illustrates it. these companies started buying each other out, or somebody came in and consolidated a whole bunch of them to achieve efficiencies. And this period of consolidation went on for about 20 years, again, without much government intervention. Then we had the advent of regulation, just like we talked previously about the public utility commissions. After this long period, Congress enacted that Mann-Elkins Act, followed very closely by state public utility regulation. And the government's concern at that point, 1913 or so, about the concentration of power within AT&T, which had already bought Western Union and was forced to divest the telegraph company. In public policy terms, think about it this way. There was a sentiment in favor of regulation, kind of the national consciousness was leaning toward regulation and not so much in favor of just a totally open free market. Standard Oil and the breakup of the Standard Oil monopoly had highlighted antitrust concerns in other industries, but with principles very much applicable to this one as well. The Titanic disaster highlighted the need for better radio systems, more regulation, more reporting, more training to prevent disasters like that in the future. And you had the proverbial 800-pound gorilla, AT&T, which was just a perfect target for federal regulation. So that's when Congress really jumped in and refined then its regulation in the 1934 Act. At the state level, the state public utility commissions caught onto this example and started regulating the intrastate aspects of these businesses. This is a fairly recent, well, it's 7 years old. I don't think it's changed much. This is a map of what some of you might remember, a few of you might not. The landline telephone business in Ohio. And I'm talking about the incumbent landline telephone companies. That's a term that is used in the Telecom Act. These are the players that have been around for 100, 120 years in some cases. And there was a smoke-filled room. I don't think Jeff was alive then. There was a smoke-filled room somewhere, and people sat in there and basically divided this map up. A lot of these companies were already serving in their given areas. The map represents, I think it's about 43, don't go to the bank on that, but it's about 43 companies within the state of Ohio that were ILECs, independent local exchange companies. The yellow is the old GTE property. Some of you remember that name, GTE. That became Verizon and is now Frontier, if I have those names right. And that's the largest geographic swath in Ohio. It's not huge in terms of population. It includes places like Marion and Athens. I think those might be their largest cities. The blue, though, the company I represented early on, Ohio Bell. And notice where Ohio Bell landed. The bankers control a lot of this, and it's like they'll lend you money to start a business in Cleveland, but not in Yellow Springs necessarily. So Ohio Bell landed in the major metropolitan areas where the Bell system had its focus, with the exception of Cincinnati. Cincinnati is a really odd duck. There are only two companies like that in the United States. That was one of the licensees of the Bell system, but was also 49%, not 50, 49% owned by AT&T. Cincinnati Bell now is totally independent. AT&T, I don't believe, has any stock ownership in that company at all. But they have a pretty big swath of territory down in the Cincinnati area. There are dozens of tiny, tiny little telephone companies. Anybody familiar with those? Like, does grandma live in Putnam County? Putnam County seems to be the hub in Ohio, up in the northwest quadrant there. I think there are 12 little independent companies in Putnam County. And it arose a lot out of German immigrants. They had their own banks, they had their own churches, they had their own schools. When the time came, they said, we'll have our own telephone company. So there's a little town up there. A friend of mine is from there Glandorf. There's a little thing called the Glandorf Telephone Company that at its peak had probably 500 customers. And now that everybody's gone to wireless phones, I imagine that number has gone down. Although in rural areas, the tendency is people hang on to their landline longer, partially because some of the service issues out in rural areas that are being addressed and have been addressed largely in many places, but rural customers are sometimes more likely to hold on to their landline telephone service. Theodore Vail at that time was the chairman of AT&T, and he really was the father of this idea of let's convert this industry into a monopoly industry. I think he'd probably read a lot of stuff about those railroad robber barons and decided, you know what, all these people are throwing capital in. We're all competing for the same customers. We're competing in the same territories. Let's divide the map up. And you guys go serve Chicago, and I'll serve New York, or I'll serve a whole state, whatever it might be. But this map on a national scale represented that development, Theodore Vail's idea of a natural monopoly. But there were sort of two parts to that equation. Vail advocated, well, if you give me a monopoly on this service in the areas that I choose, I will guarantee you that every person who wants service will get it and that it will be at a reasonable rate. So that's sort of this public policy equation that developed in this era, that the telephone companies, yes, they were granted monopoly status, but there was a lot of baggage that went along with that, this obligation to serve and to guarantee that the rates would be reasonable. We'll get into more detail on the rate issue in just a little bit. Here's the local telephone network, and again, this is the landline, the old telephone. Anybody here still have a landline phone? Oh my golly, purists. Maybe half the group. I have a VoIP phone. I gave up my old-fashioned landline phone for VoIP just several years ago, but there are a lot of folks that have maintained landline phone service, and it makes sense for a lot of people. That is just an illustration of how it works, telephone to telephone through a central office. There's a pair of wires that's connected to your phone. Often there are 3 pairs that serve your house, so there is a spare pair and also kind of an extra pair. And the extra pair was used, you'll recall, in the 1990s for dial-up internet. Luckily, they had installed extra pairs of wires to homes because people wanted dial-up internet of all things. Sit there and listen to that squeak, while it's connecting. But also home security systems typically were, and many still are, connected to the landline network using one of the spare pairs of wires serving your home. But you'll see a cable when we get to the props. And we're getting to the props here shortly. I know you're excited. Here's an early vintage view of the telephone network, that landline telephone network. To place a call, you didn't pick up a phone and dial anything. You just picked up the phone. And somebody at the other end in a location near you on what's called a cord board got a buzz, and they'd pick up the phone and say hello, and you'd say, connect me to 222. So they'd plug that in, connect you to 222. And then they'd drop off, and you'd be talking to whoever you were calling. What I want you to note is look at the dress code. Can you imagine standing on your feet in front of that cord board for 8, 12 hours a day? I don't know what their working hours were, but looks pretty awful. Long distance, as I said, long distance didn't originate with the invention of the telephone. It became something that was viewed as a necessity as the telephone system expanded around the country. And this was the forerunner to the Internet Cafe. This was a shop in Los Angeles where you had to go. You couldn't do this from your home. You had to walk down here to place a long distance call. And look how much it was, 50 cents a minute. Back in that era, that was an astonishing amount of money to call San Francisco. It's a branch office. Talk to San Francisco, 50 cents a minute. It says that on the window. This, well, I'm going to go to the props first. This monopoly model that we described really flourished from the teens, 1913, 1914, 1915, probably until the 1980s. I'm going to walk you through a few of the things. I'm keeping track of the time too. Judy said it's 2 hours, no breaks, but feel free if you need to go to the restroom. The teens, probably through the 1980s, there were a few things that impacted this monopoly telephone business early on, but they were very, if you just looked at them in isolation, you wouldn't think, that meant nothing really to AT&T and the other monopoly telephone providers. But I think as you'll see, you start piling events one on top of another, and pretty soon that whole monopoly structure breaks down, which I'll try to demonstrate. I want to somehow do the props, and I'm not sure the most efficient way to do it. And she told me to stay in range of the video here. Here's the Alexander Graham Bell story. We should pass this around. And again, if you see this in a library or on eBay even, grab it. Don Amici plays Alexander Graham Bell. Don Amici is probably the best actor in America next to Ronald Reagan. This is a rotary dial telephone. Some of you might remember one of these from Grandma's house or elsewhere, but this is the Western Electric 500. They made 20 million of these, many of them made in the plant way out on East Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio. But this is the rotary dial phone from my boyhood home. So one day it's going to be in the Kelly Museum. Feel how heavy that thing is. You throw that thing at somebody. The telephone industry, of course, was made up of copper wires, hence the success of the copper mining industry in the United States and elsewhere. This piece of cable, though, is interesting. It's a 600 pair cable, and when you see this, you'll see all these individual wires, and if you just pull a few of them out, 6 of these would be put in a strand to serve, say, a given home. And there are differences all over, but generally speaking, 6 of these wires would serve an individual home. So this cable would potentially serve 100 homes. So think of a residential street, like in my boyhood neighborhood, Clintonville. This probably would have served a whole street in Clintonville. Think about splicing this. And these things get cut and used to get cut very frequently. Contractors, road construction, you name it. People slice right through this. And they're pretty high-tech jobs in the industry, splicing these things back together wire by wire. Look at the gauge of the individual wires too. The interesting thing about that is feel its weight. That is the largest cable that would be used not only underground, but aerially. That huge cable can be fastened to telephone poles. They've got to be fairly short span because of its weight. The technology that is replacing those copper wires all over the country is fiber optic technology. And here's a little fiber optic cable, very typical of the cable that's used today. This one's about 20 years old, I think. 2 companies are preeminent in the fiber optic cable business, Corning Glass. And you might have a Corning ware dish at home that you heat your microwave food up in. That's the company that is one of the great manufacturers of fiber optic cable. If you separate a few of these, you'll see a bare strand of fiber, and it actually is glass. Hard to believe. There's a piece of what looks like copper, but it's not, in a middle strand that actually is just metal to support this. So if this is strung a long distance, it doesn't sag as much. Somebody needs to figure out how to put that to good use. But this, I think, is a 7-strand fiber cable. This single cable is the equivalent of about 10 of those. So that's how the technology has, as it often does, has shrunk and has advanced over the years. But that's a piece of fiber optic cable. Let me get back, and we're going to do the second part of the props in a little bit. This slide is something I came up with for the college students. I thought, how do you describe this closed economic system that the monopolies represented, where everything about that industry is closed off from competitors? If you want to buy telephone service, you've got to get it from your designated provider in your given area. And in return, that provider is protected from outside influences, if you will, other than maybe, inflation, just general economic conditions. But that monopoly provider in that closed system is inside that balloon and protected from external forces. What that resulted in, and this is part of Vail's idea for this industry, is subsidies. So I'm going to collect X amount of money for selling telephone service. Well, guess what? I'm not going to charge everybody the same. You might think that's the fair way to do it from a non-discrimination standpoint. But they figured out, well, we can charge businesses a lot more than we charge residential customers. And that became the model in the industry. I know in my early days, I was kind of shocked to find out because I'd never bought business telephone service. The little phone, even that black phone, if you want that in your barber shop, it costs basically twice what it does in a residence. It's technologically no different at all. It's just what was called social pricing. They charge businesses a lot more than residents, and those business rates then subsidized the local residential service in the middle. So business, also long distance prices were astonishingly high. 1950s and 1960s. I remember my parents, we'd talk to my grandparents, every Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon, and my mother would be standing there almost with like an egg timer. It's like, it's long distance, don't talk more than 45 seconds, and pass it to my brother and sister. Also, YP, Yellow Pages. Does anybody still use the Yellow Pages? I mean, the book, the Yellow Pages, when it comes to your porch, do you just put it straight in recycling like I do? The Yellow Pages was a huge revenue. Now we're back on a landline system, ironically. So, yeah. So write that down, David. I don't want to see any video of me in a hearing talking about reliability of the landline network. And let me catch up to where I was. The subsidy flows. Here we are. As I said, Yellow Pages subsidized local residential, long distance, and business. And down at the bottom is important. Urban subsidized rural. The country really did have a desire, and policymakers had a desire, that people generally paid the same price for telephone service, local residential telephone service, whether you were an urban customer or a rural customer. So there were actually a subsidy that nobody ever saw. In the city, you paid more than the cost of your service, and in rural areas, oftentimes you paid less than the cost of your service, and it all balanced out. There's a national phenomenon there too. I had a friend in Washington who represented the telephone company that serves, there is a telephone company that serves the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's the Havasupai Nation telephone company, and a lot of those folks live down there, like in the base of the Grand Canyon. It is the most expensive place in the country to provide telephone service, even wireless service, just because of the structure of the canyon. And I think their costs, at one point I saw something like $3,000 a month per customer. But this set of subsidies over the years has supported that to keep the cost of that service very low. low, as low, in fact, as some urban areas in the United States. Now, we get to bursting the balloon. That balloon that I described was this perfect monopoly system with really no intrusions for many, many years. And some aspects of these next few slides represent what are called disruptive technologies. And think about their effects on the marketplace. A good example today is Uber and Lyft competing with established local taxi cab companies. The telephone industry, like the taxi cab industry, pretty much unchanged for 75 years. From a legal standpoint, the computer industry was one of the first intrusions into this monopoly telephone network. The Deuce computer, this was a computer invented in England. I love this shot. It has its own air conditioning system and a wonderful kind of avant chair there next to the computer, but think of that in your study or your den. The Deuce computer was invented in 1956. It was part of an emerging computer industry that developed quickly after the end of World War II. In 1956, though, the government again came to AT&T and said, we've got this new computer industry starting. We really don't think you guys should be involved in it. And AT&T signed a consent decree agreeing to stay out of the computer business, except that they could use computers for their own internal purposes, switching, billing, you name it. But AT&T agreed with the federal government to stay out of what I'll call the retail computer business. It barred Western Electric, which then was the manufacturing arm of AT&T, from any activity other than manufacturing the equipment. At the same time, there was antitrust action underway against IBM, which was this upstart computer company based in New York. And IBM had run into trouble over the terms and conditions of selling versus leasing computers that got the attention of the Justice Department. So there's also, in that same era, a consent decree governing the retail sale of computers by IBM and others. A next event affecting that monopoly model is, of course, the invention of the radio. And we talked about the sinking of the Titanic. 1912, Congress enacted the Federal Radio Act to try to make sure that ships stayed in touch with both other ships and stations ashore. It mandated that all radio stations in the United States be licensed by the federal government and required that seagoing vessels continuously monitor distress frequencies. Microwave technology is the next example of a technology that helped burst this bubble. Microwave licenses were first issued by the FCC in 1959, but before that, the technology had to come into play. And there was a Army Signal Corps engineer by the name of William McGowan, who left the Army after World War II and started experimenting with a bunch of Army surplus stuff that he bought. And he set up a microwave system between Chicago and St. Louis and was able to transmit. This is like Bell and Dr. Thomas Watson. McGowan was able to transmit voice over his little microwave set, if you will, between Chicago and St. Louis. He approached a bunch of banks and said, hey, maybe you guys could use this to send this is the new computer industry, all your data processing could be sent over my network instead of the telephone network. And they liked that idea. And he set up a system. He had to get it licensed by the FCC. And they went to the FCC and applied for what was called a private microwave license. It finally was approved. 1969, again, a 4-3 vote. There was sufficient interest at the FCC to help this upstart company in a new technology that competed with not just the business of the telephone industry, but was impactful of that closed monopoly system. The next one is one of the ones I mentioned, funny little things that occur along this history trail that you don't think are very impactful. This guy named Carter invented this thing, the Carter phone. It was a device. A lot of people had two-way radios, and he's down in the oil fields in Texas. He actually was a rancher, but he was near the oil fields in Texas, and he came up with this device that if somebody called his home on their two-way radio, he could just take the receiver of the phone and lay it in this device and turn that into a telephone call, if you will, called an acoustic coupling device. Nobody had ever thought of this. He sold something like 3,500 of them, but guess what? AT&T filed a complaint against him at the FCC saying, now wait a minute, we have a tariff that says you cannot connect anything to our network unless we've approved it, and it's been approved by the FCC. Well, that case, as you can imagine, dragged on for many, many years. But Carter finally won that case, and it really is the forerunner to all the stuff that came later. Answering machines, modems, faxes, you name it, stuff that we started plugging into the telephone network, and it wasn't owned by AT&T. It wasn't controlled by them. Some of those things weren't even licensed by the FCC. Most were, though, because there was an interest, and the rule became, as long as it doesn't damage the telephone network, you can plug anything into your socket at home. Nick Johnson was an FCC commissioner at the time, and he's written a couple of really interesting books. This is like in the Johnson administration. I think he might have been the first Johnson appointee, and I can give you that site later. He wrote just an excellent law review article sort of analyzing how the FCC came to this decision. Keep in mind, AT&T, one of the most well-funded companies in the country, is fighting this every step of the way at the FCC and in the court of public opinion. Bursting the bubble, the yellow pages. Well, here's another legal impact on this wonderful closed economic system. The court started looking at the copyrightability of not only the yellow pages, but the white pages directory. And in a series of decisions, one of them a US Supreme Court decision, the courts basically came down on the side of, if all you're giving me is a list that has no real artistic or creative component to it, that is not copyrightable. So that became the law of the land, that the telephone company, even though they're probably still marked with a little C down in the corner, probably not a valid copyright, either the yellow pages or the white pages. Now, within the yellow pages, people have ads that they have copyrighted, logos, designs, that sort of thing, but the compilation of them is not. There's a Wikipedia article on this. It's really funny. It says, as a result of this rule of law, that you've got to have some kind of intelligence or creativity to support the copyrightability of a list. The list might not be copyrightable, but the book of lists is. Do you remember the book of lists? It's something that came out in like the 1970s, pretty popular book that just had lists of all sorts of different things, every subject you can imagine. But the courts at some point, or some legal scholars chimed in and said, well, there's a lot of creativity to putting that book of all these lists together, even though the lists individually might not be. Here's another legal impact, the divestiture of AT&T. The government, again, gets into the act and filed an antitrust suit against AT&T in 1974. Coincidentally, it was filed on the very last day of the Nixon administration, and it was filed by Ohio's own former Attorney General William Saxby, who at that point was the U.S. Attorney General. A consent decree was finalized in 1982. The divestiture occurred in 1984, creating what were called the baby bells. I won't go into a lot of detail on those, but suffice it to say, this monolithic company, AT&T, was divided up into 7 baby bells and still a little bit left of the mothership, which was given control of what they believed at that time would be the very lucrative long distance business. How many of you have paid recently for a long distance call? That tells you how lucrative that business has become. Ted Turner comes into play because cable TV then became another sort of intrusion into the safe haven of the monopoly telephone network. Columbus had its own example of this. Anybody remember this? Warner Amex Cube. Columbus is a test market, of course, for a lot of stuff. And the Warner Media Company, this is before they merged with Time Magazine, but become Time Warner, offered a cable service, 60 channels. That's the remote. And the remote's as big as like a tablet computer. And it's a wired remote. It's not a wireless remote. It connected to your TV, but it gave you, the early versions were 30 channels, but the one that became most popular, they had 30,000 customers on this network in Columbus. And it was decided at one point that it would not be a commercial success and was not rolled out around the country. But they managed to have 30,000 subscribers here in good old Columbus, Ohio. Cable TV is just an interesting industry in itself. It came into being because people couldn't receive TV signals over the air. So it came into being in places like my original hometown, Parkersburg, West Virginia, down in the Ohio River Valley, hard for TV signals to reach. And it's one of the first marketplaces that cable TV was installed. And entrepreneurs, investors came to places like that and started stringing coaxial cable wherever they could. Telephone poles, electric poles, sometimes with permission, sometimes not, to build cable TV networks. And as you've heard, Ted Turner then got into the mix with programming. You know, it's one thing to build a network, but man, you got to have some content to deliver to people to make it interesting. And Ted Turner is the guy that put those two things together. A lot of content delivered over cable TV at relatively low rates. Although, you know, you can debate about cable TV rate regulation. It's basically not regulated today and is a fairly competitive industry. Some would say vibrantly competitive. Within a short time, some of the other players got into a cable-like service. Time Warner here in Columbus started providing access to the long-distance network. Remember, long distance is still a pretty important thing, and it's very expensive. And they figured out a way to connect businesses to the long-distance network at cheaper rates than people paid the telephone company to do that. That was, again, part of this blowing up of the monopoly network. The Telecom Act of 1996 was enacted. In many ways, it didn't do much other than recognize what was already happening. It didn't advance the ball that much. It just kind of set a legal structure for this new structure within the industry, which had become a fairly competitive industry, even in the local markets. But it underscores a guarantee of competition for local telephone service. Long-distance competition was already very vibrant, companies like MCI and others in that field. The cellular telephone. Now let's get into the, not quite the 21st century. There's a slide in there on T96, but we'll not deal with that one. Here's a map similar to the landline network. Everybody understands, of course, how their cell phone works, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but The key to this technology, and it's the people at Bell Labs that actually came up with this. So thank you, AT&T, for another fine invention. All those rings represent, the output of a radio transmitter, and it gets weaker as you get farther out. And they came up with this idea of, hey, if we can overlap these things, you might be able to go from one place to another, to another, to another, and never drop a signal. So that really is the basis for the cellular telephone, and that's why it's called. It looks like a little amalgam, if you will, of cells of various kinds. There's a little thing down at the very bottom. I think it says no service. I can't see it from here. No signal, thank you. If you're outside of one of those areas, you aren't going to get a signal. But these things now proliferate around the country. You will find dead spots once in a while. But I remember in the early days, you'd drop a call driving from Columbus to Cleveland. I haven't had a call drop in 20 years now. But you hit Mansfield, primarily because of the geography, your cell phone call would be gone. Not so anymore with towers and the expansion of the network. Several European countries had introduced cell service long before the United States. It took the FCC about 10 years to determine the appropriate market structure for what the cellular telephone service would look like. We're going to talk about the props here again in a minute, but here's a fun facts sheet about the iPhone. The iPhone was introduced in 2007. For the first 5 years, AT&T had an exclusive deal with Apple to sell the iPhone. Apple, by year end of last year, there were, 2.2 billion. Think of that number. 2.2 billion iPhones have been sold since its inception. Some analysts believe that device saved not only Apple Computer, but saved AT&T because of that exclusive deal that AT&T had. Apple Computer now has a market capitalization of $950 billion. It is 17 times larger than General Motors, which is just an astonishing figure to me. I mean, somebody that grew up in this era where the auto industry, that was the biggest industry in the country. Apple Computer, 17 times bigger than General Motors. Let's talk about a few of the props again. Some of you probably own, they still own some of these. Oh, you're going to lose me, aren't you? The bag phone. Open this up. This is a lot of fun. Yeah, you took this to your car, plugged it into the cigarette lighter. It's a rechargeable battery, but it's got to really be on power most of the time. And just like a fire detective, pick up that phone from your bag phone. That technology lasted about 5 to 6 years. Martin Cooper, our friend from Motorola, is the guy credited with devising the Dynatac 4000. Isn't that a great number? So this was affectionately called the brick phone. You'll see why when you hold it. Took about 6 hours to charge and only gave you like 3 hours of even on air time and only about 1 hour of talk time on a full charge. When this was introduced, the cell systems in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Chicago were pretty well developed, and a few in other parts of the country. But the airtime in that era was typically $1 a minute. So think about today talking for $1 a minute on your trusty little cell phone, no matter what kind you had. That's the brick phone. We have a whole bunch of other examples. Everybody's seen the flip phone. Anybody still carry a flip phone? They're actually becoming popular again because people hate all the complexity of the technology. I've got a couple of Blackberries here that everybody used a Blackberry. I used one for a while. And they were neat devices. I didn't care for a virtual keyboard. It took me a while just to, get used to the idea of a virtual keyboard. I like the little keyboard, as little as it was. Here's a Motorola StarTAC, Motorola MicroTAC. There's another kind of flip phone, but here's one of my favorites. I forget which one. They're both kind of the same era. I think the rounded one is actually the first. The first generation iPhone. Look at the size of that. And if you're carrying an iPhone right now, compare it to the size of your current phone. I think there's a movement underway. People saying, hey, give me that really small one again that'll fit, in my shirt pocket or a watch pocket on a pair of jeans. So the technology, of course, has just advanced leaps and bounds. I apologize for doing it this way, but I think I should have brought a shoebox. Hand them around. David, you mind starting that? And they're in no particular order, but it's the size of those devices that I think is just hilarious. I've got to move on here rapidly to get to a couple of things we're going to focus on at the very end. Here's a figure. I don't think I mentioned this figure, but here's a figure that's critically important in today's marketplace. How many people actually still use landline phones? And look at that figure for children with wireless service, only at 67%, and well over 50% of adults have wireless service only. The internet, state regulation of wireless. Let me mention this. The states were prohibited by Congress in 1993 from regulating the rates, terms and conditions, not terms and conditions, entry of or rates charged by the wireless companies, which was really an astonishing move by Congress in light of the structure that the Communications Act of 1934 had set up, which was this two-sided regulation, both federal and state regulation. The feds regulating interstate aspects of the business, the states regulating the intrastate side. The internet is another thing here, critically important to the future, if you will, of the monopoly telephone system. That is allegedly a copy of the actual cocktail napkin on which the internet was proposed by a bunch of engineers at a Mexican restaurant in San Jose, California. It involved 4 universities and a company called SRI that was a defense contractor. Look at the date, December 1969. 50 years ago this year. So same time essentially as the moon landing, just a hilarious iteration of the first map, if you will, of the internet. The internet grew, of course, by leaps and bounds, still is largely unregulated by the government, and has led to technology such as voice over the internet. You remember they were talking about voice over the telegraph wire. Somebody finally figured out, well, we're going to send voice just like a packet stream over the internet. So that came about and is a very active technology today. The first VoIP, voice over internet protocol application was rolled out in 1991 as a free service. Here's fun facts about the internet. That's in the materials. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Some of those are really interesting, though. But if you look at that level of internet traffic per day, it's 3 trillion gigabytes. Again, an astonishing number. There's VoIP. Here's one of my favorite slides, convergence. And this is something that all these examples are meant to illustrate, is the convergence of all these separate technologies really into one big, I like to call that the amoeba. It's sort of just an amoeba now with all of this technology operating inside of it. All things that when I was growing up, and I'd say a few of you in the room maybe, you could do all of these things. You could send a message, talk on the telephone, watch a movie, watch a TV show. listen to music, read a newspaper, magazine, or book, take a picture. You couldn't surf the internet, but you look at those first 7 and then add number 8. All of those things have merged onto this platform that we call the internet, and they've merged for the most part into one device that you can carry in your pocket, which is just an astonishing technological transformation just in the last 20 years. Current public policy issues. I got to really move fast. Chapter 4, mergers is one, and if you're following any telecom mergers, one that's very active just in the news in the last couple of days is T-Mobile and Sprint. Any T-Mobile or Sprint customers here? Okay. The Justice Department approved their merger. It's still subject to FCC approval, but FCC has kind of signaled, yeah, we're going to approve that with conditions. And some of the conditions, even those agreed to with the Justice Department, are interesting. Sprint is going to have to spin off several of its businesses. Virgin Mobile is one. I forget their other brand off the top of my head. Boost, thank you. You see all their stores. Sprint's going to have to spin those 2 brands and a couple of really minor entities off. And guess who's buying those? Dish Network. So now we're going to have the satellite TV company take T-Mobile's place as the 4th largest wireless provider in the United States, which is just a remarkable turnaround from just 10 years ago when it was the wireless companies, dominating, not cable owning any of them, and not Dish Network or DirecTV or any of the satellite providers owning any of them. So the mergers are something to keep an eye on, just very interesting developments. State regulation. I want to mention this is because we have some people here involved in state regulation. And I'm going to jump to one part of this slide. You all kind of know the development of state regulation of these services, and it's declined substantially over the years. I've got a slide to show that. But one of the things I've thought an interesting concept, and friends of mine have been involved in the motor carrier industry for many, many years, and they went through congressionally mandated deregulation in an act passed by Congress in 1980. And the result of that really is the states have very little to do with the motor carrier industry other than safety enforcement. And they don't make up the rules. They enforce federal rules that are applicable in the motor carrier industry. And I've often thought, maybe that's an appropriate model for this telecom industry moving forward, that there be some federal standards on, maybe it's how you do business, I hesitate to say service quality, but, just maybe some parameters around which you operate, and let the states enforce that. You don't need to go to Washington, D.C. to file a complaint necessarily. You could go to your state commission or some other appropriate agency and have that complaint heard. Ohio regulatory reform. We've had, and this is all in the materials, we've had a long, long track. I've been lucky to be involved in many of these of regulatory reform in Ohio. Some states tried to do this all at once. Nebraska tried to do this all at once in 1989, and within about 4 years they repealed it because they figured out, oh my gosh, we went way too far in deregulating this industry all at once. So Ohio has taken, I'd say, a very progressive and incremental path toward the deregulation of the landline business. Again, and to repeat, Congress has precluded the PUCO from regulating the rates or the entry of any of the wireless providers. Mergers, we talked about that. Let's jump to net neutrality. A huge issue just, in the last few years. I'd say toward the end of the Obama administration, it really cranked up. I mean, we had petitioners coming to our door on the issue of net neutrality. It's a great buzzword. I think it's kind of a loaded buzzword. It was conceived by a NYU professor by the name of Timothy Wu, and it was kind of this idea that common carrier principles ought to apply to the internet, that everybody ought to have access. There ought to be some safeguards in terms of non-discrimination, in terms of access and usage of the internet. Everybody should be treated fairly, to use that term. And he created quite a few public writings and developed really quite a good analysis of his view of how the internet should be governed. The problem is the internet is not one entity. The internet is made up of dozens, maybe hundreds of entities that own pieces of that infrastructure. They operate it really on a cooperative basis, but there's not a room like this where all these people gather and figure out, which direction are we turning in the internet? It just sort of morphs along on its own without a lot of government intervention or regulation. So there's more detail in the materials on net neutrality. I also want to mention privacy and security. Telecom privacy. The US, interestingly, really has no single source of privacy regulation. There are all kinds of federal laws that talk about privacy. There are privacy laws that govern pieces of this telecom industry and apply to the users of some of these technologies, but there's no overarching privacy law in the US. Now, contrast that with European countries, especially European Union countries, because the EU itself has model privacy legislation that's been adopted in several countries over there. And you'll read of circumstances where, Germany has figured out that Google released, 10,000 names. There are huge, huge fines associated with that in the European countries. Not so much here. You see instances of that in the United States, but our regulatory framework just hasn't changed to the point that you could call anything an overarching general law governing privacy in the United States. I apologize, there's a lot of stuff in the materials on this. Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which is an outgrowth of the old wiretap statutes. You had to go get a warrant from a judge to wiretap somebody, and that's essentially still the law, even on the electronic and internet side of things. You need a warrant. You need at least probable cause to go look at or ask a provider for billing records. You can't listen in on the conversations, but in some instances, you do not need a warrant to look at certain records within the telephone companies. Security, I want to mention that just briefly. It's a real concern. All the hacking and the bogus calls that you get. I think a lot is being done at the federal level, not so much at the state level because of the lack of jurisdiction, frankly. But they seem to be staying ahead of some of the pirates, not all of the pirates, because the pirates figure out, hey, you're going to block us from doing this, say telemarketing calls, robocalling. They figure out another way. A lot of that is done from offshore locations. So those laws, even if they're enacted and they look like they're bulletproof, are very difficult to enforce, depending on where those calls are coming from. So that was my 2-hour overview. I apologize for rushing at the end, but I'd be glad. I think we've got time here for any questions or any further discussion on any of these topics you'd like to engage in. Nobody? Nobody had a flip phone? As Judy said, it's the 3-hour sessions have what, a 15-minute break. For this one, we get no break at all. But I think, is it appropriate to give out the number to wrap things up? I think I finished the slides. Nope, there's one, Q&A. That will